"Melissa, what happened to your voice?" I asked her this because Melissa, my stunning coworker with mixed heritage, had lost her voice and could barely speak. And of all days, today was the one with the crucial presentation that could decide the fate of our company. I knew how much effort Melissa had put into this, going so far as to gather representatives from overseas publishers to promote our company's works internationally. Because of that, I couldn't just suggest postponing it or scheduling another opportunity so casually. But with Melissa's voice in such a state, there was no way to proceed. She must have realized this herself. With tears in her eyes, she said, "Timothy, please help me." With a voice so sorrowful that it was painful to hear, she bowed her head. Determined, I quickly reviewed the presentation materials and prepared myself to take on this critical task on the spot. My name is Timothy. When asked what they've spent the most time on in life, many people might answer work. However, there are probably a few people like me who have spent a lot of time working but aren't particularly dedicated to it. Before the global pandemic turned the world upside down, I was the kind of person who worked just enough not to drag the company down and left the office promptly at closing time. One reason my approach was tolerated is that sales often relies heavily on individual performance. In the sales department, I was squarely in the middle, far from being at the top, but with plenty of people below me in performance. By maintaining decent sales numbers, I managed to avoid reprimands from my boss. I work at Greenleaf Publishing, a mid-sized company. We primarily handle comic books and light novels. Many authors start by establishing their foundations with us, and some go on to achieve significant success, securing serialization deals with major publishers. After taking a detour during college for a year, I started working at Greenleaf Publishing when I turned 24. Over the next 10+ years, I encountered my share of trouble, but I've now reached a relatively stable point in my career. It may not be exciting, but I didn't mind. I thought a life like this, steady and predictable, wasn't so bad. Then, one day, the sales department suddenly got a new hire. "Hi, I'm Melissa Suzuki. I've been speaking Japanese since I was a kid, so you can count on me. Looking forward to working with you." With her polite yet slightly commanding tone, she introduced herself. Her light brown wavy hair, sharp jawline, and striking features immediately caught everyone's attention. Her mother is American, and she had spent her life moving between Japan and the United States. After graduating from an American university, she had joined a publishing company there before deciding to switch gears. "I see potential in Japanese subculture, especially light novels and comic books, so I joined Greenleaf Publishing. I can also speak English, French, and Spanish, so feel free to reach out if you need help." The men in the sales department were obviously smitten by the radiant smile of the stunning, mixed heritage Melissa. Judging by her confident demeanor and the way she carried herself, I quickly concluded that she was highly capable. "It feels like someone from an entirely different world has joined us," I muttered to myself as I got back to my own work. As it turned out, my assessment was spot on. Despite joining mid-month, Melissa managed to rank in the top 3 for sales that month. A clear testament to her talent. Though she initially struggled a bit with the differences between Japanese and American business practices, her ability to quickly find her own way and adapt must have been the key to her success in securing contracts. Meanwhile, I kept working at my usual pace, letting the chorus of praise for Melissa drift over me. "Have a good evening, everyone." As I called out while leaving the office at closing time, no one in the sales department responded. Maybe they were too absorbed in their work, or maybe they didn't see people like me, who work at their own pace, as real colleagues. Their cold attitude might bother some, but to me, it didn't matter. I was already organizing my thoughts about what I needed to do after getting home when Melissa suddenly stood in my path, blocking my way. Melissa stood firmly in front of me with her arms crossed and demanded sharply, "Timothy, you're capable of so much more, aren't you? Why don't you put more effort into your work?" Melissa leaned in closer, pressing her questions with an assertive tone. Although I was taller than the average man, her heels brought her nearly to my eye level. I felt an odd sensation, as if I were being cornered by an actress in a foreign film, but I shook my head slightly and replied, "Everyone has their own lifestyle, right? My performance isn't harming the company, so I don't see any real problem." I made sure to respond as calmly and unemotionally as possible. Melissa furrowed her brows and said, "That's not what I'm talking about. Even if you leave on time, there are things you could do, like increasing the number of client visits or creating clearer materials. To me, it looks like you're cutting corners in your work. When someone like that is in the team, it lowers the overall motivation of the department. What do you think about that?" She leaned in so close that our noses were just a few centimeters apart. Caught off guard by the scent of her rose perfume, I instinctively took a step back and replied, "I'm not cutting corners. This is the best I can do." I glanced around as I made my rebuttal. Melissa must have noticed that the other coworkers were now watching us. Melissa let out an exaggerated cough and leaned in to whisper near my ear, "Timothy, are you hiding something? Someday, I'd like to uncover your true self." With that, she walked away. The next day, as I prepared to start work as usual, I was suddenly summoned by Kevin, the head of the sales department. When I arrived at his desk, Melissa was standing beside him, looking as though she had been eagerly waiting for this moment. Frowning, I glanced at her, but Kevin beamed and said, "Given her exceptional performance, I thought it would be good for the other employees to learn from her American-style sales techniques." I discussed it with her, and she gladly agreed. "You're the top candidate to accompany her and learn from her methods. It's an honor, isn't it? So, what do you say? This is your chance to stand out." Standing next to the department head, Kevin, Melissa wore a triumphant expression. It was clear now that she had meant every word she said the day before. I was about to find a way to decline, but Melissa spoke up first. "I have no intention of interfering with Timothy's lifestyle. I'll do my best to ensure he can still leave on time. All I ask is that he accompany me on a few of my sales visits when he has time. If it doesn't work out, he can stop any time." Though she usually spoke with unwavering confidence, this time, there was a hint of pleading in her voice. That detail caught my attention, and after glancing between Kevin and Melissa, I finally nodded and said, "All right. I'll do it. Looking forward to working with you." From that moment, I began accompanying Melissa on her sales visits, and I quickly saw firsthand why she was so successful. Simply put, she excelled at using her diverse range of conversational tools at just the right moments. When a client shifted to casual small talk, she effortlessly chose topics that appealed to them, easing her way into their comfort zone and closing deals before they realized it. At other times, she passionately described the allure of the work she was promoting, using her enthusiasm to sway the client's emotions. Having spent much of her life in the United States, Melissa had a broad knowledge of global culture, ranging from films and fashion to sports and economics. Sure, she was as striking as an actress, but even without her looks, I had no doubt Melissa would deliver the same stellar sales performance based on her skills alone. No matter how exceptional she was, I had no intention of changing my approach. I continued doing the bare minimum required and left the office promptly at the end of the day. Melissa seemed disappointed by this, but she never stopped taking me along on her sales visits. During one of these outings, she revealed what seemed to be her true motivation. "I want to showcase our company's works to the world," Melissa said, clutching a light novel from Greenleaf Publishing in her hands. As she sat in the passenger seat of my car, her eyes burned with a fiery determination. While Japanese anime and comic books are popular overseas, Greenleaf Publishing's works have yet to break into international markets. Melissa fervently explained that these works, being of such high quality, represented a huge business opportunity if introduced globally. More than that, as a fan of Greenleaf Publishing's creations, she simply wanted as many people as possible to discover and appreciate them. 6 months into her tenure at Greenleaf Publishing, Melissa finally had the opportunity to make her dream a reality. Through her diligent networking with overseas publishers, she arranged a presentation to showcase Greenleaf Publishing's works. In a spacious conference room, representatives from more than 10 international publishing companies gathered. If this presentation went well, Greenleaf Publishing's works could spread across the globe. On this critical day, I was called upon as a support staff member. Knowing Melissa, she would surely handle it well. The presentation was to be conducted in English, but having worked at an American company, it should be no problem for her. But fate can be cruel, and accidents tend to strike at the worst possible moments. When Melissa finally arrived, late for the final pre-presentation meeting, her voice was so hoarse that strain didn't even begin to describe it. These days, most people stay home when they're unwell, but at the time, pushing through illness to come to work was still common. Though she had tried to mask it with makeup, her flushed face and watery eyes were clear indicators of her condition. Melissa, with her raspy voice, insisted she didn't have a fever, but regardless, presenting in such a state was out of the question. Maybe it's best to postpone, I thought to myself. However, knowing how hard she had worked to gather these international representatives, I couldn't say it aloud. Her complexion worsened as the minutes ticked by. 10 minutes remained until the presentation began. Judging that her condition made it impossible for her to proceed, Melissa looked at me with pleading eyes and said, "Please, could you present in my place?" She bowed her head with a raspy voice. Seeing Melissa quietly wipe away the tears of frustration streaming from her large eyes, I felt something stir deep within me. A feeling I hadn't experienced in years. All I need to do is present the works on that list, right? I asked, picking up a spare copy of the materials for the attendees and organizing the key points in my mind. Seeing her wide-eyed and nodding repeatedly, I nodded back and replied, "All right. I'll do my best," before stepping up to the task. At the start of the presentation, Melissa had explained in her strained voice that she couldn't speak and had asked a colleague to take over. The room murmured with unease, but when I began speaking fluent English and said, "Don't worry. I'm quite the enthusiast myself, so I'll make sure to convey the full charm of each work," the crowd's surprise quickly turned to admiration. A glance at Melissa showed no hint of shock on her face. I'm pretty sure I never spoke English in front of her. That thought crossed my mind for only a moment before I dove into the presentation, passionately showcasing Greenleaf Publishing's works. Fortunately, I had read each of the featured works at least once, so I was able to articulate their appeal smoothly. To provide a clear framework, I started by mentioning well-known existing works and explaining that the featured works were similar to them. From there, I outlined their unique appeal, gradually capturing the interest and attention of everyone in the room. My strategy seemed to work perfectly, as nearly everyone raised their hand during the Q&A session after I finished explaining. One question, however, proved to be a bit challenging. It concerned the conceptual meaning of a specific term that appeared in one of the works. The question came from a representative of a French publishing company. While they understood the surface meaning of the term in English, they struggled to grasp its nuanced implications in their native language. The work I had introduced featured a unique world-building style, characterized by specialized terminology created specifically for its setting. Indeed, it could be challenging for non-native English speakers to fully understand the meanings of such specialized terms. I took a moment to breathe and refocus before replying. Let's see, in French, the term from that work would carry a meaning close to this. Specifically, I answered the question in fluent French. This surprised not only the person who had asked the question but also the other publishers in the room. After completing my response, I checked the list of publishers and, noticing representatives from Spain and Italy, I said in English, "I see we also have representatives from Spain and Italy. Allow me to explain this in their respective languages as well," before proceeding to deliver the same explanation in Spanish and Italian. By the time I finished presenting all 10 works in multiple languages, the clock had long passed noon. Even with a short break in between, I couldn't remember the last time I had spoken for such an extended period. The overwhelming fatigue, as if I had aged 5 years all at once, was worth it. Every publisher in attendance expressed their desire to publish Greenleaf Publishing's works in their respective countries, while the finer details, such as translation and distribution channels, would still need to be ironed out. Establishing this foothold was a significant first step. Great job. As expected, Timothy, you're amazing, Melissa said, offering her congratulations as she had fully supported me throughout the presentation. The word expected caught my attention, but what shocked me even more was her complexion. You should really see a doctor, I blurted out, unable to hold back my concern, as her face was flushed bright red. Melissa shook her head and said, I've occasionally had fevers like this since I was a child. I have some fever medicine at home, so I should be fine after taking it, but her legs wobbled, and she had to steady herself against the wall. I couldn't just leave her like this and return to the office on my own. Looking directly at her, I firmly declared, then at least let me take you home. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to take you to the hospital. Perhaps because she wasn't feeling well, Melissa meekly nodded and said, All right, please. I'm not sure I'll even make it to my apartment once we get there, bowing her head slightly. 30 minutes later, I was supporting Melissa as we rode the elevator up to her apartment. Her feverish body radiated an unmistakable heat, which I could feel through our close contact. Even on the way here, I repeatedly suggested taking her to the hospital, but she adamantly refused, going so far as to threaten to jump out of the car if I insisted. The last room at the end, she murmured as we stepped out of the elevator. Following her instructions, we shuffled down the hallway, practically moving in sync, until we reached the final door. There, I spotted an elderly couple standing in front of it. I couldn't help but mutter, wait, as I recognized the man's face. Before I could process it further, Melissa, standing beside me, spoke words that took me completely by surprise. Dad? Mom? What are you doing here? Her hoarse voice prompted a reaction from the elderly couple. The man turned out to be none other than Thomas Suzuki, the president of Greenleaf Publishing. Beside him stood a foreign woman whose features closely resembled Melissa's, so she was likely her mother. Realizing that Melissa was the president's daughter left me stunned, and as I struggled to process the revelation, Mr. and Mrs. Suzuki began walking toward us. Taking over for Melissa, whose voice was still hoarse, I explained the situation in detail. When Melissa nodded in agreement with my explanation, Mr. Suzuki gave me a small bow and said, Timothy, I'm sorry for the trouble. I'll explain everything in detail another time. For now, I just want Melissa to get some rest, is that alright? He spoke with a fatherly concern I had never seen at work. Although I had plenty of questions, Melissa's health was the priority. I handed Melissa over to Mr. and Mrs. Suzuki and said, Understood. I'll take my leave, then. After bowing, I left the apartment. The next day, Melissa didn't come to work for the first time since joining the company, likely because her condition hadn't improved. Then the next day, Saturday morning, as I was enjoying a leisurely day off, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed the name Melissa. When I answered, her voice was still not fully recovered as she said, I'm sorry about the other day. If it's alright, could you come over? I'd really like to thank you and apologize properly. Don't worry, it's not a contagious illness, and I'm feeling much better now. Just a bit hoarse. I also had a few things I wanted to ask her, so I decided to take her up on the invitation. I had assumed her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Suzuki, would also be there, but when I arrived at the apartment, Melissa was alone. When I asked how she is feeling, she replied that she was fine, though her voice was still slightly hoarse. Thanks to you, the overseas publishers have decided to handle our works. I'm truly grateful, she added. When I responded that helping out a hard-working colleague is something anyone would do, Melissa frowned and said firmly, Anyone? Not just anyone could pull that off. She immediately shook her head and said, "Sorry, that's not what I meant to say," before pressing her lips together and lowering her gaze. As the awkward silence lingered, and I hesitated over whether to speak, Melissa raised her head. Melissa stared at me with a serious expression and said, "I heard about your situation from my father. I'm so sorry for saying such rude things. Assuming you were slacking off without knowing the full story." Her voice trembled as she apologized. It seemed that Mr. Suzuki, Melissa's father and the president of Greenleaf Publishing, had explained to her why I ended up in the sales department and why I approach my work the way I do. "No, it's fine. I understand how someone like you might find my attitude off-putting," I said, reflecting on my past as I spoke. When I first joined the company, I was assigned to the editorial department, where I learned the ropes from senior colleagues. In my third year, I was entrusted with my first solo assignment, managing a light novel author. He was Marcus Kennedy. Marcus and I worked tirelessly, side by side, striving to create the best work possible. I should have been the one to look out for him, but Marcus was so dedicated to his work that he ignored his own health. And I got swept up in his passion, working tirelessly without sleep, pulling all-nighters as a matter of routine, and even spending weeks shuttling between his workspace and the office without going home. After living like that for several years, tragedy struck. One day, when I visited Marcus's workspace, I found him collapsed over his desk, unconscious. Fortunately, his life wasn't in danger, but he decided to retire from writing light novels to focus on treating his illness. Later, I received a letter from him saying that, while his health had improved, he no longer had any intention of picking up a pen again. I got scared. When I dedicate myself to something, I lose sight of everything around me. That fear made me realize I could no longer work as an editor, so I confessed everything about Marcus's collapse to Mr. Suzuki, who was investigating the incident. Melissa listened silently to my confession. I remembered how Mr. Suzuki hadn't interrupted me once, patiently hearing me out. When I finished telling him everything, Mr. Suzuki said something that stayed with me. "Timothy, you were the one who discovered Marcus, weren't you? While others dismissed him as ordinary. You believed that polishing that uncut gem would make it shine, and you nurtured him into a first-rate author. It would be a waste to lose such keen insight. How about working in another department while sorting out your feelings? In the sales department, where individual results are valued, you could contribute while managing your fear of overcommitting yourself." Mr. Suzuki then asked for my cooperation with something. He wanted me to review the works brought in by aspiring authors and those that caused disagreements within the editorial department, providing my feedback. The reason I always left work on time was to spend my evenings reviewing manuscripts and compiling feedback. It was an important task that directly influenced the company's future direction. Since I found it hard to focus in the office, Mr. Suzuki graciously allowed me to adopt my current working style. "You were contributing to the company in a different way all along, weren't you? And yet, Melissa's voice trembled as she murmured after hearing my story. It wasn't surprising that someone like her might have taken the attitude she did without knowing the full picture. I wanted her to understand that I had already accepted this and didn't hold her responsible. When I reassured her, Melissa gave a sad smile and said, "Timothy, you're so kind. By the way, I don't think I properly explained why I kept the fact that I'm the president's daughter a secret." She then shared her story with me. Before leaving her job in the United States, Melissa had a heated discussion with Mr. Suzuki. Melissa argued that Greenleaf Publishing should expand overseas, while Mr. Suzuki cautioned that failure was likely unless the company first solidified its reputation domestically. It was Melissa's proposal that finally brought their stalemate to an end. "I'll pave the way for overseas markets myself. You won't have any complaints if I succeed." Melissa joined the company under the condition that only a few senior executives would know her identity as the president's daughter. From there, she achieved remarkable sales results, proving herself and accomplishing her goal. She kept her lineage a secret because she didn't want her colleagues to treat her differently. It was truly a case of actions speaking louder than words. I'm sure Mr. Suzuki was impressed. When I said this, Melissa shook her head vigorously. But I ended up getting sick at such an important moment and causing trouble for you. There's no way I could have handled it alone. Timothy, you really are someone I can rely on. This time, she looked at me with a relieved smile. Yes, what I wanted to know today was the true meaning behind the, as expected, that she occasionally let slip. You speak as if you've known me for a long time. Have we met somewhere before? Deciding there was no point in overthinking it, I voiced the question that had been on my mind. Melissa's large eyes widened even further as she murmured, so you really don't remember, and her shoulders slumped. But she quickly raised her head, stood up from her chair, and brought up a nostalgic yet puzzling topic, saying, Timothy, you used to visit the home of an American author named Amanda Fisher, didn't you? How do you know about that? I asked, but before I could finish, she pulled a book from her bookshelf. It was a light novel published by Greenleaf Publishing 20 years ago. The cover was worn and stained, likely from being read countless times. The moment I saw the book, a flood of memories came rushing back into my mind. Fixing my gaze on Melissa, I asked, could you be Lisa? The face of a young girl from long ago vividly appeared in my mind as I spoke. That's right. You may have forgotten my face, but you remembered this book. Hearing her mischievous laugh and childlike tone, I was reminded of my time studying abroad in college. When I stayed at Amanda Fisher's home in the United States. Amanda, who was a lecturer at the university I attended, often invited me and a few other students to her home as we studied American literature. It was there that I met Amanda's niece, a girl named Lisa. She was half Japanese but knew nothing about Japanese media, so I gave her an impassioned lecture on the wonders of comic books, anime, and light novels. Wanting her to experience them firsthand, I handed Lisa, who I now know as Melissa, one of my favorite works that I had brought from Japan. At the time, I was a child who loved nothing more than being active. Although my father worked at Greenleaf Publishing back then, he never forced me to read books. Attending an American school, I frequently visited my aunt's house because I wanted to play with her dog. But then you came along, Timothy, and completely educated me. There's no doubt that you were the reason I decided to work in publishing. Melissa said nostalgically, flipping through the pages of the light novel I had given her all those years ago. It was surreal to think that the young girl I had met back then had grown into such a stunning woman. As I marveled at the strange connection Greenleaf Publishing's works had forged between us, Melissa placed the book on the table and looked at me again. Back then, I admired you for speaking so many languages and interacting effortlessly with other exchange students. Even Amanda confided to our family that you were the most outstanding among the students. That's why, when I reunited with you and saw you seemingly disheartened at work, I couldn't help but lash out. I had studied multiple languages to read literary works in their original form and to exchange ideas with peers from around the world. Even now, I love literature. However, in today's world of diverse entertainment, opportunities for literature to shine are rare. It was my hope that by introducing people to accessible forms of storytelling like comic books and light novels, they might one day develop an interest in literature. That's why I chose to work at Greenleaf Publishing. Sorry for showing such an embarrassing side of myself. Oh, and my apologies. I slipped into casual speech because I can't help but think of you as the girl from back then. When I apologized for unintentionally switching to a casual tone out of nostalgia, Melissa shook her head. Please, don't use formal speech. I already told you, didn't I? I secretly thought you were so cool back then. It was just a little admiration for an older brother figure at the time. But now, it's different. On the day I lost my voice, you helped me. And I found you incredibly charming. Even now, my heart races when I think about it. I don't think I've ever felt this strongly about someone before. I don't want to let this fate between us end here. It took me a few seconds to fully grasp that Melissa's words were a confession of love. Being confessed to by a woman 7 years younger wasn't something that happened often in life. And to think it was a woman I had reunited with in such a fateful way. Melissa looked at me with anxious eyes. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I began to organize my thoughts and speak. To have someone as wonderful as you confess their feelings to me, honestly, it hasn't fully sunk in yet. But I'm truly happy. And I want to work hard to become a man worthy of you. If you're okay with someone like me, would you be willing to go out with me? Speaking in the same tone I used when talking to her as Lisa all those years ago, I conveyed my feelings. Melissa squeezed her eyes shut, nodding repeatedly with emotion, and said, "Thank you, Timothy. It feels amazing to have my feelings reach the person I love. You've taught me something wonderful once again." A year later, I visited Mr. Suzuki to formally ask for his blessing to marry his daughter. I had braced myself for anything, even a harsh rejection or a physical reprimand, but instead, Mr. Suzuki smiled gently and entrusted Melissa to me with his full support. Afterward, I returned to my former workplace in the editorial department. Ever since the day I stepped in as Melissa's substitute, my passion for work had reignited, and upon conveying this to Mr. Suzuki, he approved my transfer back. Meanwhile, Melissa joined the newly established international division, dedicating herself to promoting Greenleaf Publishing's works overseas. When we finally managed to take a long vacation together, we visited Amanda's home in the United States. The purpose of the visit was, of course, to thank her for being the one who had brought us together. Though we had invited Amanda to our wedding, her fear of boats and planes had prevented her from traveling to Japan. I can't believe you two ended up together. Mind if I use this as inspiration for my next story? Amanda, ever the writer, welcomed me warmly after 17 years while showing her creative streak. After Melissa and I expressed our gratitude, we took our time exploring the house where we had once spent so many memorable moments together. "Let's be happy, Timothy." She placed her hand on her stomach, reminiscing about the past. I placed my hand over hers and said, "Yes, for this little one as well." With that, I solidified my resolve to create a loving home where our future child could grow up surrounded by smiles,